Bowman, Managing Director of Conscious Governance. We've just come out of a pretty intensive webinar, haven't we, Steve?
We have indeed, with some of the best questions I've heard in a long time. So looking forward to it.
As usual with our Governance Made Easy webinars, we get inundated with questions, and we've decided to do something a little different today and just read them out in a Q&A type format. So let's get stuck into it, shall we, Steve?
Let's go for it.
Okay, the first one from Hugh. Is it worth canvassing directors for agenda items prior to the meeting, or does that become too cumbersome?
So one of the issues of canvassing directors is often that you get people trying to make things up or putting their pet projects forward on something like that. You're much better off having a culture where if a director has a strategic issue that is worthy of board discussion, that they contact the chair prior to the board meeting to ask the chair to include it in the agenda. Now, the chair has the right to say yes or no at law, because the chair actually owns the agenda. So the director who's asking for this new item that they want put on the agenda for discussion has to convince the chair that it is actually strategically important. So they have to actually make the argument for why it should be on the agenda, not just say, I'm a director, I've got the right to have that on the agenda, because actually they don't. It's the chair's right to decide what goes on. So preferably I would have a director call up the chair prior to the board meeting and say, look, I've seen the draft agenda. I'd really like this other item put on there. I think it's strategically important because of the following issues. It aligns with our strategy. There's got real problems with our risk profile around that, and I think it's worthy of board discussion. And then the chair will either say yay or nay based on the quality of the arguments that the director has made to the chair.
Excellent. This one from Karen. Regarding the common law aspect, do you see this applying in a board of trustee environment with a school context?
So one of the comments that I made before that one person didn't agree with actually, and
I saw that.
Yeah, but I'd have to say I'm actually correct. There are three types of law that we need to be aware of that dictate how we function. The first one is what is in our constitution. So normally that's through your local country body that deals with corporate structures. So in Australia, it's the ACNC, it's the Corporations Act. All right, so they'll have standard constitutions that meet the requirements of that particular act. So the constitution is our first legal document. Now, if it's not in your constitution, then it will be under the legislation of some sort, either legislation or regulation. If it's not under the legislation or the regulation, then it will most commonly be at common law. Common law is also called case law. Case law is when a case comes up, someone does something, complains to someone else, it goes to a judge, that's the case, and the judge makes a judgment. That then becomes case law, and it's seen as a precedent for that particular situation. At some stage, it may find its way into the legislation because it was an important case of law that was worthwhile actually looking at. But often it's just around the case law. So the sequence of events is look at your constitution first. If it's not there, look to see if it's in the legislation. If it's not in the legislation, see if there's any case law. And if it's a particular interest, it may actually become a court case. Now, that applies to every corporate entity, no matter how it's constituted. So the long-winded answer made into a short-winded answer would be, yes, it does apply.
Excellent. Well done. Here's a small one from Gordon. Is the chair appointed by the shareholders or the directors?
Well, it depends on what your constitution says. So it purely depends on whether or not your constitution says that the board appoints the chair, or whether it says the members or the shareholders appoint the chair. The argument for having the board appoint the chair is that the chair's role is so important that they have to make sure as a board they get the person who's best suited to be chair. It should not be a popularity contest. So we find many organizations where the members or the shareholders actually appoint the chair, but usually the chair has mounted a campaign, so they've got an agenda, or the shareholders want the chair to represent them, which at law the chair can't do. And so it's fraught with danger. It's not a popularity contest. It really should be the board appoints from amongst themselves a chair. Now, the interesting part is that there's a common legal precedent here that those who appoint can also unappoint. So if the board appoints or elects the chair, then the board can unappoint or unelect the chair, not as a director, but just as chair. They have that right. If the members or the shareholders elect the chair, then only the members and the shareholders can unelect the chair. Where that becomes a problem is if your chair is not really good at it. And most people are not really good at chairing boards because they haven't had the experience or the training. So again, short answer, it should really be the board that appoints the chair.
Excellent. Let's go to another one from Tim. This is a good one. Where do you suggest is the best place on the agenda to list the vision of the organization? Here is our document here, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, where it goes there. Where would you say it goes, Steve?
Well, the purpose of having the vision statement on your agenda is to remind directors why we're there. So I want it right up front, right at the very top, big and bold and maybe in a color, only because we need to be reminded that our role as a board is not to meet. Our role as a board is to create the future for the communities that we serve. So we're there as a board to make choices that create the future for the communities that we serve. We're not there to meet. Meeting is a tool. It's not our reason for being. So let's remind all of our directors of why we're there in the first place. And in fact, it's a very useful thing to have, because if you're having a particularly fractious conversation, or maybe sometimes a confused conversation, or we're not quite getting to the point on that one, any one director can read out the vision statement and say, okay, here's our vision, or here's our purpose. Let's look at it through the lens of this. What would it look like if we looked at each of the elements and try and reframe the conversation to actually address our vision or our purpose as an organization? It is the most powerful tool if used, and useless if it's not used.
Very good. From Sarah, can the chair add other businesses that wasn't previously in the agenda?
The chair has the right to actually craft the agenda as he or she sees fit. So there's two things. You should never have
Can they change it halfway through?
Halfway through what?
Halfway through it's been presented.
So can the chair add an item to the agenda for what's happening at that board meeting? Yes, they can. They're the one who run the meeting. They have the right to actually ensure that the stuff that is being addressed by the board is in the right sequence, which is usually strategic, big, deep, meaty conversations first. The monitoring stuff can come way towards the end, because that's less relevant unless there's a big, meaty conversation around the monitoring. For example, there should never be verbal presentations on something. There should always be, here's the paper, give me a chance to read it, give me a chance to think of the questions, and then a discussion around that. But I want to see it written down first. So the board, the chair can actually introduce a new topic if it comes up and it's relevant.
Got it. From Debbie, we often have directors requesting time for free discussion at meetings, no prep, just bringing out items for discussion that happen to be on their minds. What is your position on this?
I think there are good points and bad points to that, because if there's nothing on their mind, if they come up and whatever's on their minds, is it going to be a story they heard about where someone wore the wrong coloured uniform at their local service, or is it something that's actually strategically important? I would much rather have I would not have a open section. I would have something called either strategic gossip or emerging strategic business, or some other term that reflects, it's not just what's on my mind at the moment, it's framed in a way that enables me to look at the higher picture. Right. So if you have something on there, usually at the end of the meeting, in a lot of boards, they have something called other business. Get rid of it. It's got no place in the modern board agenda. What needs to be there is the ability for a board member to raise an issue that is of such strategic importance that the board hasn't considered before.
Right.
And that is the place for it. And then we can prepare for the next meeting, or at least have some discussion around that. But you're best off letting the chair know about it prior to the board meeting rather than at the board meeting.
Brilliant. Nicely segued into this next question from Sanjay. As a chair or audit committees, can I include strategic gossip on audit committees' agenda?
I love it. Why wouldn't you do this? Everything that you do at the board level, the same thinking should occur at your subcommittee level. So if you've got an audit or a finance audit risk committee or an internal audit committee or a people, culture, nominations committee, whatever board committee structure you have, again, the really important stuff up front, the vision of the organization to remind us of why we're there, the strategic implications behind that information, and strategic gossip. What have you heard out there in terms of audit that might actually be interesting? Oh, I have heard through one of my colleagues or one of the events that I went to that audit is now taking a much greater role in culture. Is that something that we could actually discuss and maybe put a paper up to the board around that?
We should have had Georgia Henry with us here this afternoon.
She'll be there at some stage.
Okay, next question. This is from Ken. We have an item on the agenda. It's called Emerging Strategic Operational Risks. Should this be removed?
Oh, does it work? Does it add value to the conversations?
Yeah, if it does, leave it there.
If it does, leave it there. Now, I'm not sure why you would call it emerging strategic operational risks. That's probably a few too many syllables. Why not just call it emerging strategic risks, or preferably, my preference is emerging key risks. Yeah. And so, there's a couple of emerging key risks that really should be on the agenda for at least the start of a discussion, and then maybe some deep diving and maybe a bit of research on it. But one of the things that should start appearing on all agendas now is the emerging risk, or the emerging key risk, of artificial intelligence. Why? Biggest opportunity, biggest risk. What's that got to do with the board? Well, hang on a second. The board is responsible for privacy at law. Artificial intelligence puts a whole new meaning on this role of privacy, collection of information, use of information, reliance on information, keeping people's private details. It's a whole new nuancing around that. And the board really should start to get its mind around, we need to put some guidelines in place for our organization about how we might be looking at this. And privacy and dispute resolution, a range of other policy type areas, need to take artificial intelligence in play in stride. Yeah. And that, to me, would be a fantastic conversation, possibly led by someone who knows some stuff in this area, possibly not, as an emerging key risk.
We have a great webinar coming up just on that very topic with the very expert Julian Moore.
Julian Moore is really good on this area. For those of you who haven't heard Julian Moore, he's probably one of the best in the Southern Hemisphere when it comes to strategic partnerships. And now he's really starting to take the high ground when it comes to the role of AI in governance and board. Very, very cool to be able to share the stage with you. Yeah.
Yeah, can't wait for that webinar. Okay, one here from Mike. No, that's not a question. This is from Kelly. Could we please give some more examples? Get rid of that. Could we please give some more examples of leading indicators, especially NGO charitable sectors?
Okay, so the key thing behind a leading indicator is it gives you an indication into the future about what might be happening. We had a good example. I was just finishing off today a strategic plan for a major Catholic school, and they're looking at their feeder schools, and they're looking at having to maybe change it from just their traditional feeder schools to a much wider section. Now, a lagging indicator would be number of enrollments. A leading indicator would be how many families are thinking of enrolling their child in the next 3 years. One of them gives us a chance to actually have some wiggle room and do things in between. The other one is just a report on what has been. That's a lagging indicator. Leading indicators might be your reasons for variance in your financial report, in your P&L. A lagging indicator might be we're down by 20%. A leading indicator might be people are no longer interested in our events, so we therefore need to start looking at what we can put in place to increase knowledge and engagement in different sorts of events. Let's start thinking about that now, and put in place what people are thinking about where we're heading.
Yeah.
That's more of a leading indicator.
Nice. This one here, I think I can answer actually. Michael asks, can you provide some guidance for CEOs on how the CEO report might look like? What does a strategic report look like, and what does an operational report look like? Mike, there is a fantastic template on our website. If you go to the resources section on our website, just type in CEO report template. It's one of the most highly ranked keywords on Google. You'll find it listed there, and you can download it and make use of that. For the second part, I'll hand that over to you, Steve. So that part was, what does a strategic report look like rather than an operational report?
Sure. Great question. And most CEOs' reports are operational in nature because they talk about all the operational stuff that's going on in the organization and who they've met and where they've been. Right. And interesting, all the directors will read it, but it's not particularly useful. It's just, again, proving how busy the CEO's been. We've all been there. We've all done it. I used to do that as a CEO until I saw the light.
Mm-hmm.
The strategic CEO's report will focus. I saw a fabulous example just on the weekend from one organization, and the CEO's report essentially says emerging strategic issues that I want to alert the board to. And what they did then is they had one emerging strategic issue that wasn't on the horizon, but something that was worthwhile for the board to look at. And then they had a summary of how we're going against our strategic plan. And it was just a simple watch or on target. And then their next one was in a different color, how we're going against our risk management plan on our key risks, on target or watch. And then the other one, I think, was on how we're going against our major contracts, on target or watch. So it immediately supported, if the directors wanted, with links to some more details behind it, but it immediately gave a heads up of how we were going in the key areas. This same report also provided like a 2-sentence summary of how each of the operational programs were going and if there were any exceptions that the board needed to know about. And in this case, there was one exception that was worthy of board attention. So it was only a 3-page report. I read it twice. It was so good.
Very good. Stephen asks, what on earth are in-camera meetings?
Stephen. In-camera is an old Latin term, which if you're an old Latin still means something, but it means essentially out of session. So these days, instead of the in-camera term, we're tending to use, or I'm encouraging boards to use, board-only session. That is, only board, no executives, including the executive director. So it's in the listed company space, it's usually the independent directors that are not staff. In the other spaces, it is the board, but no staff, including the CEO involved. Right. And typically it has 2 roles. One of them is to look after the performance management of both the CEO and the board itself. So this is where the discussions would be had around performance frameworks, performance measurement of the CEO, the results of the board governance review that they might have done could be done first in camera and then taken to the full board meeting. It should never be about a complaints system, board members airing their complaints. But it's also about behavior management. If a board member is behaving badly, the board only session is a great way to pull them up publicly without being public. You don't want to influence staff perceptions around some things that need to be only done around the board only session. There's a lot of really good articles on how to run board only sessions. But I would say probably 2/3 of them are badly run because they're used as a complaints or a litigation before the board meeting to get people's agreement on a decision coming up in the board meeting. Totally inappropriate. Shouldn't happen.
Just two more, Steve, to get through. Let's have a look. One from Kath here says, so if a director is a no-show at a board meeting, should we just report them as absent?
Yes.
Yeah. On to the next.
Now, the reason that question came about is that you actually don't accept their apology. See, the only time that you should accept a director's apology is if they have participated. The law says that directors have to participate. It doesn't say participate in board meetings. They just have to participate. So if they're not participating, then they're not attending board meetings and they haven't contacted you to say that they've read the board papers and can you please make the following comments on my behalf, or ask these questions on my behalf, or I have no questions. Now, in your own constitution, why this is important, in your own constitution, every constitution has this. In most jurisdictions, there'll be a clause in your constitution that says that you are deemed to no longer be a director if A, convicted of an indictable offence, B, of unsound mind, whatever the words might be, C, bankrupt, D, not attend 3 meetings of the board without board permission. Now, why is that in there alongside indictable offence, bankrupt? Okay. If you do not attend board meetings and you do not participate, then you are deemed to be a not suitable director. Now, that clause says without permission of the board. Now, the only time you should give permission if they have participated. I don't care if they're on the Bahamas on a yacht somewhere. They still have access to internet. And I want to know they've read the board papers and they either have no questions or here are the following things I'd like raised on my behalf. So that means that all directors, no matter whether they can or can't, should attend the meeting, should get their board papers. So there's no such thing as leave of absence. There's no such thing as an apology just because I can't attend the meeting. We need to get a little tougher on this because there are many boards where directors just don't show up because it's a long way or something's come up. No excuse. You should at least call or send an email saying, here are the issues that I'd like raised. If your car breaks down and you're stuck in the middle of the Nullarbor desert, 4 hours from anywhere with no internet, okay, we'll give you permission on that one. But that would be the exception rather than the rule.
Fair enough. 2 last questions, both short ones. From Kelly, it's a tech question. Can color coding be done on BoardPro? Now, what Kelly's referring to here is this wonderful document. This is a strategic agenda template document, which is about, I don't know, how many pages, Steve? About 10 pages?
Well, it's 10. The agenda itself is only 2.5 pages. And then there's all the explanatory notes for those directors that need to be convinced this is a good idea. So, there's a bit in there on how to use it and why it's useful and all that sort of stuff. Now, the color coding, just a word of advice on color coding. Strong suggestion, don't just color code, also have words that describe it, because some people are colorblind. So we don't really want to put them at risk on that one. And the other hint, and we probably should change it on that agenda too, Sean, is if you've got color coding, then put the words in that color block in reverse white, because then when you print it out, it'll be, and you've only got a black and white printer, it'll print out as black. So just little subtle things. But color coding, red will typically mean a paper that is for decision. Blue will typically mean a paper for discussion.
Yep.
And orange or yellow will typically mean a paper that is for noting. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what the colors are. We had one recently, just a couple of days ago, where they actually color coded it according to the 3 colors of their logo. That's fine, but I'm used to seeing red, attention, green, not so much attention. So just be aware. Don't make it too fancy. And
all hopeless if you're colorblind like I am.
Yeah, exactly right. So always have the words in there as well.
Linda finally asks, allocating...
the question, sorry, Sean, the question was, can BoardPro do it?
BoardPro. No, at the moment we can't do it, but it's certainly something we would look at in the future.
Yep.
For sure. Linda asks, allocating timeframes to agenda items, is this the role of the chair?
Usually what happens is whoever first crafts the agenda will potentially also put in timeframes around it. So it could be the company secretary, which is becoming more and more common because they're now becoming specialists in governance and often the conduit between the CEO and the board themselves. Sometimes it's the CEO, they have first crack at it, but then the chair can amend it. It's their agenda. So should the chair do it? The chair should look to see if it's already been done and amend it accordingly. So yeah, I've seen examples where the CEO has given 10 minutes for a really powerful but very divisive question and 30 minutes to go over the CEO's report. And the chair said, no, we're going to swap that around. So it's the chair's responsibility, but usually it's someone else who has first crack at it.
Excellent. Let's finish off with the fantastic white paper that you put together with Brendan Walsh.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you want to just give us a quick overview of what's in that, Steve?
Well, what that does is it covers a whole range of thinking behind crafting an agenda. There's a bit more information in there than what we covered in the webinar. So it goes through, why are agendas typically not crafted terribly well. I think there's 14 or 15 key points in there about what makes a really good agenda. Then it goes through and gives you an example and the template for the agenda. And then there's a whole lot of description of how to get the best out of the agenda. So there's a whole range of stuff in there that is not based just on good ideas, but a whole lot of very wise directors who are very good at what they do, sharing their best tips with us that we have shamelessly incorporated into a white paper.
It's a brilliant white paper. Now I'll show you how you can get a hold of that, everybody. I'll just get a hold of some tech here and share my screen. So if you come to the BoardPro webinar site and you scroll down to our on-demand webinars, you'll see the latest webinar from today, Setting the Strategic Board Agenda. If you just click on that, and underneath the video, which you can replay the webinar here till your heart's content, we have the link to the webinar presentation deck from the webinar today, the strategic board agenda template, which is the Microsoft Word template that we spoke to earlier, and then the white paper. And then if you're a podcaster, you can download the podcast and read that.
Or listen to it.
What's that?
Or listen to it.
Or listen to it. Did I say read it? Excellent. Well, that sort of brings us to the end of our session, everybody. Thanks, Steve, for your time this afternoon, just explaining those questions. I think it's a really good way of tying off the webinars that we have done.
Well, possibly if people could leave comments on whether they found this interesting and useful and whether it's something that's worthwhile. And possibly if you put enough questions underneath there as well, too, we might do another one answering those questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All righty, everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks again, Steve. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks all. Bye now.